So I'm glad that you're here. Thanks for being here. I'm going to introduce my brother, older brother, in case you're wondering. He's much older than I am. No, he's only 3 years older than I am. He is the uh, choir program director, choral program director, and organist for the campus ministries of Notre Dame in South Bend, Indiana. What that means is he directs and helps out with various choral ensembles within the campus ministry and specifically at the Basilica, and also plays the organ for services and manages like a ton of different organ things that happen, like the bajillion weddings that they have, and coordinates master students and things like that. And I think you have a studio, as an organ studio as well, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
John is also a brother with the Order of Saint Luke. So for you Methodists and liturgical scholars out there, you'll appreciate knowing that about Jonathan. And let's see, you have degrees from Florida State University, Notre Dame University, and you studied for a bit over at the Mozarteum in Salzburg, Austria. So without further ado, Jonathan Hehn, take it away.
All right. Thanks, Brian. Appreciate that walk-up music that you gave me there a little while ago. Yeah, glad everybody is here. I'm sorry that I can't see your faces, but that's the reality of what we're doing nowadays. But I'm really excited to be here and talk with you, get a little bit of feedback. I've tried to make this as interactive as possible. So I would really encourage you, when we do have a break for questions or whatever, just to chime in. So I wanted to start by saying that this is a presentation on auditions and interviews, and that kind of presumes that there are jobs to be had. And I just want to encourage everybody to say that there are jobs out there in church music. I get a number of kind of email blasts with various jobs that come open around the country on a regular basis. And even during the pandemic, the job market seems to be strong in church music. So that's an encouraging thing. I wanted to, let's see, get my presentation going here. I wanted to first just round out a little bit about who I am, though Brian did a great job introducing me. So I have obviously the role that I have now, but in addition to that, I've had a lot of roles in the past that I think make me a little bit well qualified to talk about this subject of auditions and interviews. So my current role, I'm a choral program director and organist for the campus ministry at Notre Dame. I work primarily in the Basilica of the Sacred Heart, which is kind of the main chapel on campus. Notre Dame is very unusual. There's around 40 chapels on campus, all of which have their own worship life. So the Basilica kind of functions like a little mini cathedral for the campus community there. And so I direct the Basilica Schola, as well as assistant directing a few other choirs. And I do things like Brian said, I coordinate all the wedding music. We have about 90 weddings a year at the Basilica. I plan all of the daily mass music, and just kind of work out as part of the team. And then kind of on the side of that, I also teach in the sacred music program. I have an organ studio and teach for them, and really enjoyed doing that. So that's kind of where I am now. But I also have had a lot of pastoral. So I've had around about a dozen jobs so far in my career, between the fact that I've had to move around to do various degrees and just kind of moving around for jobs that have come open. That's meant that I've had to go through the audition and interview process a lot. And like a lot of church musicians, it's been rare that I've only had one job. Even now, I have more than one job, being both a term professor for sacred music and working full-time in campus ministry. But any of you musicians will know that rare is the church musician that has one full-time job and doesn't do things on the side. So because of that, I've just had a lot of roles. I also kind of speak, pastor, and musician. So I have 2 degrees in music and then 2 degrees in theology. And I've always had a really keen interest in bridging the gap between the kind of the world of clergy and the world of musicians. I think that's one of the key things that I can bring to this realm is just being able to know the way that clergy like to talk, the way that people within the church kind of view their work, and the way that musicians who are trained in a secular setting tend to talk, the values that they hold. Like I said, I have two music degrees from a public university, from Florida State, which is very much a conservatory-oriented kind of environment. And because of that, I understand really well the values of judging music from a secular perspective. But then my other two degrees from Notre Dame in sacred music and liturgy, those have really taught me to embrace the theological aspects of music making and the pastoral aspects of being a church musician. And my headspace, because of that dual training, has always been to try to integrate those things into a more or less unified whole. Over the course of my career so far, I've had really beautiful experiences. One of them is at the church I currently serve, the Basilica of the Sacred Heart. I am incredibly happy there, feel fortunate to work there. It's been a beautiful place to work in a beautiful community of faith. I've also had beautiful experiences at the church that you see pictured here on the screen. That's First Presbyterian Church in Havana, Florida, where I kind of cut my teeth as a church musician. That was the first role where I was actually the director of music. It's a little tiny church, but had amazing pastoral leadership while I was there during my undergraduate years as a student and in a few years after that. So, you know, a beautiful experience in a very large cathedral-esque church, a very beautiful experience in a very small, like under 50 member Presbyterian church. But then I've also had some really painful experiences at a church that I'll probably speak a little bit about later, sharing a story from that. And just churches where the fit was not good, not easy. And I tried to learn from that, especially in the years since, kind of reflecting on how things went, what I could have done differently, what other leadership of the church could have done differently. And then in preparing this talk, I also just listened to a lot of people. I actively asked for some feedback from pastors and musicians on what they would bring to a conversation like this. So people kind of with a lifetime of wisdom. So I'm speaking not just with ideas of my own, but with ideas from those around me in the musical realm, as well as the realm of clergy. So I'll stop now and maybe because I want to know a little bit about who you are, so that as we go along, I can tailor a little bit of what I'm saying. So I'm asking Brian now to put up a poll to help me figure out who you are. Yeah, and Brian put in the chat there a couple of really nice shout outs. One is for my new book, Reshaping the Liturgical Tradition. That's where I'm wearing my liturgy hat. I co-edited that with Martha Morkish, who's an incredible scholar and friend who teaches at Candler Seminary in Atlanta, or in Decatur rather. And then a little shout out to the Reverend Bill Bess, who was the pastor at the time where I worked at First Presbyterian Church, himself a career church musician before going to seminary and becoming a minister of word and sacrament, and was really a great mentor to me as I kind of cut my teeth in church music. So let's see, who are we here? Looks like about 75% so far are local church musicians. That's wonderful. Also a lot of ordained clergy people and pastors. And I see a number of different educational levels. That's really, really great. Some teachers and some others. I'd be curious to know, maybe people want to put it in the chat, what other roles, what other identities you have. While that continues to come in, I wanted to just press on to the main part of this talk. The first main part being what pastors or hiring committees maybe ought to ask. And for those of you that are clergy, if you have feedback on this as we go, please do stick that in the chat. So like I said, I've been through this process a number of times. And most of the time it's been a pretty good experience, but sometimes people don't really seem to get what they need to ask. And that can be problematic, just because if the interview process isn't thorough and well thought out, you can end up working with someone that's really not a good fit for you. And that's just really crucial, especially from the church music perspective, where the musical leadership is also part of the pastoral leadership. So I think, first of all, it is appropriate to ask about the candidate's spiritual background, right? You're expecting this person to be a leader in the church beyond the realm of the musical. No church musician functions just as a musician, but musicians function as number one, along with the pastors. The musicians are probably the most visible leadership in the congregation. They're up there in front of people who are in a loft, in my case, every single week, right? People see and hear and experience what you do as a leader week in and week out at worship. And so for that reason, I think next to the clergy, the musicians usually are the most influential leaders in any congregation. I also wanted to just give a caveat that what you're going to ask of your candidates is obviously different depending on the job that you're looking for, and depending on the tradition you're in, and depending on the candidate that you're looking at. What you're going to ask for a 10-hour per week position that largely just involves maybe one weekly rehearsal and a Sunday morning is going to be vastly different than what you're asking for somebody that's going in to work a full-time position, overseeing other staff, et cetera. So that just kind of goes without saying. So I would say, for one, try to keep the questions on a deep level and something that people are going to have to prepare. So don't ask maybe questions that I might tongue-in-cheek refer to more as silly, right? Don't ask what their favorite hymn is. Don't ask what's your favorite passage of scripture. Those things are maybe useful in the moment for, having something entertaining to do, but it's too easy for someone in that case just to name something that they've thought about as a passage that they particularly like. But that doesn't really tell you a whole lot about what about the depth of the person's spirituality, and it also doesn't really tell you anything about how they're going to interact with the congregation or with you as the staff or committee that's hiring them. What I would do is lean more into deeper questions about how the prospective musician is going to relate to the congregation and the staff. So perhaps if you want to ask what's a favorite scripture passage, you could ask how that applies to your life as a leader in this community of faith. Or if you're going to ask what's your favorite hymn, you might retool that something like, what is a hymn within your tradition or within this tradition? Say if you're in an Episcopal church, what's a hymn within the Anglican tradition that really speaks to you, and how do you see that integrating into the life of this community, right? So always thinking about the person as an integral leader in the community. I would also say that you want to function, to ask about the candidate's spirituality and history, but you're going to want to also look at the way the musician's actually going to function in their role. So spending lots and lots of time just doing all of the kinds of music making, especially the things that are going to happen every single week. So for nearly everyone, I'm imagining that's going to include leading congregational song, right? Hymn and song accompaniment, whether that's from a keyboard or from a guitar, or in an a cappella tradition, just from your own voice and hands, right? Ask them to conduct something, ask them to do some sight reading, ask them to do some solo performance. I've been amazed at the times when I've gone to do interviews and when I've talked to former students or colleagues who have done interviews, how many times people will have an interview and they'll be asked to play, say like a piece of organ repertoire, for instance, but they don't actually ask the person to do any of the things that they're going to have to do in church on a weekly basis. So for my money, I'm going to put a lot of emphasis as someone doing an interview on congregational song accompaniment. And when that's the case, asking them to do it with people present, you can't really tell how one interacts with the congregation until you have an actual congregation. It's something that I encounter a lot with my organ students, right? I teach them how to play hymns, but you can't really learn how to play a hymn until you have people singing along with you, and you have the dynamic interplay between leadership and congregation, right? Between, or in the way I like to think of it, between the accompanist, who is the organist or the guitarist or a song leader, and the congregation. And likewise, if you're doing an interview, you can't know what that's going to be like until you have people singing. So in the process of the interview, it's really helpful to just have a group assembled together, 4, 5, 6 people, and have them sing a hymn with someone accompanying. You can tell a lot from that. Same with conducting. If they're going to be a conductor of choirs, don't just have them submit videos or recordings, but have your choir present, have them come to a rehearsal, have them sit in and do the thing so that you can really tell what they're like in the moment. Same goes, I think people also often fail to have somebody sight read. This is a skill that is of crucial importance in church music, because you're forever needing one more piece of service music that you got to pick up and play in the moment. Or if you're hiring primarily an accompanist who's going to work with choirs, you're going to need to ask them to sight read something, because oftentimes you're going to throw an anthem at somebody in a rehearsal and just ask them to go. Somebody asked a really pertinent question, and that is, are we assuming people are singing at this point in the pandemic? Unfortunately, no. So I'm talking about what we might do in normal times. So I would say if you can't have a group actually singing together, to have them submit a video of real-time accompanying of a congregation singing from some other point. But that being said, I know a lot of places nationally are not singing together yet. But you could, if you wanted to get really creative and really want to have somebody sing live, distanced singing with masks in an outdoor setting is something that the recommendations right now from the scientific community says is safe. So it would be possible, for instance, to have your musician set up a keyboard outside, or just roll a piano outside and have somebody accompany people with masks on, seated outside, or something along those lines. But I recognize that that's really difficult to accomplish depending on your setting. And Brian also points out that with a large space, like a typical sanctuary, a small group in a short amount of time singing is safe, especially if you keep a distance of 6 feet or more and everybody wears a mask. There have been a lot of good data kind of compiled about that. Okay. Whoops. So I'm getting through this pretty fast. I just want to take a quick look at the poll here, if you'll indulge me just for a second, because I haven't seen it before since everybody's finished chiming in. Okay, other roles: instructional aid, administrative assistant, band directors, choir directors, junior high. Okay, that's super helpful, thanks. All right, so I'm going to move on here. Again, if this is still under the heading of what pastors and other committees ought to ask or ought to think about, it's very tempting to think of musicians as just working the hours that they are physically present at the church doing things. So playing for worship or holding a choir rehearsal. But it's a really important thing to remember, and I think pastors actually are good about remembering this, that musicians don't just work those hours where they are physically present at the church, but there is a lot of time that goes into preparation for that kind of work. So for instance, for every hour that I am in a rehearsal, I'm spending at least a couple of hours picking out music for that rehearsal, practicing it myself at the keyboard or practicing at the conducting stand. doing things like making the copies of public domain music so that I can have that available for my choir, which I do a lot. I sing a lot of Renaissance music with one of my choirs, or spending time online ordering copies and getting them put into binders and things like that. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. For every Sunday morning service that you're going to play, you're going to need to assume several hours of practice by your musicians so that they are well prepared. And the reason I say I think clergy people are good at remembering this is because people often assume that the clergy are only showing up on Sunday morning and doing their preaching and leading worship, and that's all they do. But of course, it takes many hours of sermon preparation, of reading biblical commentaries to even get ready to say what you're going to say, of doing pastoral visits, and things like that, of going to administrative meetings in the middle of the week. So the same is most often true with musicians, even part-time musicians. And I would say that part-time musicians, oops, sorry, I'm going to close the poll here. The part-time musicians also typically piece together a living, right? They're not living off of one full-time position with benefits. So it's important to remember that those kinds of folks are going to need some support. And if you as a church staff person can help them by providing any sort of benefits, medical insurance, stipends for that kind of thing, if you can't afford that, or just a healthier salary, that will really help reduce the pressure on your musicians, make them happy, make your working relationship better. But there's also things just beyond the monetary, things like time off. One of the great inequities for church musicians with in comparison to clergy in a lot of denominational traditions is that clergy will typically get some sort of in addition to paid vacation, some sort of sabbatical time every several years. That's quite common depending on your tradition. But musicians rarely ever get that, right? So be thinking about the fact that even part-time musicians need some time off over the course of the year. And especially for your full-time musicians, it might be appropriate now and again to allow them to take a bit of a sabbatical, even if it's just a short one of a few months. There are other obvious things that the laws don't well represent, but the churches can be really good and flexible about, parental leave being an excellent one, and things like continuing education allowances, book allowances, so your musicians continue to learn and grow. Ryan, did you need to pop in? I saw your video turn on there for a second.
No, sorry about that.
Oh, no worries. Okay. For those of you that would be wondering to yourself, you're like, where do I get this information? Because there is a lot to swallow. And of course, different denominational polities just mean that people are going to be approaching things differently. I wanted to point out a couple of good ones for you to consider. And I'm actually just going to make my own screen a little bigger here so I can read my own writing. You can see them in the little purple circle on to the left of my head. And these are in no particular order, just the order I happen to copy and paste them in. Several denominations publish documents to assist church committees and staff people in their hiring process, and to help them in an organized way think through the kinds of issues that I'm raising here. One is from the Association of Lutheran Church Musicians. They have one of the more thorough websites that I've encountered. So it's rather than being a single document, ALCM has just compiled all of this kind of information and questions and a number of different documents into the website and on employment resources. So if you go to their website, which I believe I give a link to in the handout that you've gotten, you can see there a lot of the questions and issues that they ask people to work through. It's a really, really great resource, and one that's been recently updated. Another one is from the Presbyterian Association of Musicians, a document entitled Guidelines for the Employment of Church Musicians in Presbyterian Churches. This one's a little bit older. I'm not sure how old, but still a really, really useful resource. PAM, I think, is one of the larger and more active denominational music associations, and really has a great thing going with this particular resource. PAM is also, like some other denominational organizations, one that asks you to consider the certification level of your musicians. If you didn't know it was a thing beyond just educational level, that is academic degrees, a number of organizations, including PAM and the AGO, NPM, and others, offer levels of certification for those people that have gone through continuing education programs and certain numbers of hours of work, and also in most cases some sort of examinations to achieve a certification level. So I myself have a couple of those from the American Guild of Organists, and I really value them, especially one of the exams that I took, the choir master exam, was every bit as hard as my master's comprehensive exams. So it's not an easy process. And for those people that have gone through the work to achieve that certification, I think that's a really important signal that you're looking at a quality person. The National Association of Pastoral Musicians, which is a Catholic organization, largely Roman Catholic, has a really useful document called the Director of Music Ministries in the Parish, Work and Remuneration. And then the Fellowship of United Methodists in Music and the Worship Arts has the rather tongue-in-cheek title, Paying the Piper, a consideration of church musicians' salaries, in a similar vein to these other organizations. I should also just point out the last thing in that little list, a bit of a bonus document from the American Guild of Organists, considerations for calculating the weekly hours of an organist and or director of music at a religious institution. The AGO used to have a more thorough document called the AGO Salary Guidelines, but after some recent negotiations with the Federal Trade Commission, retooled that as a more streamlined document that you see here. So other organizations historically have drawn on the American Guild of Organists worksheet just because it was so thorough. They even went so far as to providing salary guidelines based on cost of living adjustments across the United States. I used those guidelines myself in a number of, successfully in a number of job negotiations, salary negotiations. So it's a really tremendous resource. And even now, I think a couple of these denominational resources also point one towards the AGO document. So it's a really useful one to know, even though it's not specific to any religious tradition. Okay. So those are some things that I think pastors and other hiring personnel at churches ought to ask. I don't know if I wanted to stop here and see if there's any feedback, but I'm looking in the chat and someone did usefully point out, Judy Tyler said, please remember about the Affordable Care Act for healthcare insurance as well, healthcare.gov. And that's a really excellent point. I myself actually made use of that when I transitioned to a new position in South Tampa that I had for a few years before moving up to Notre Dame. So the church was not able to provide health insurance, but did provide me a stipend that covered my health insurance through the Affordable Care Act. So things like that, creative solutions from church personnel committees can be really, really handy. Okay. So here's the part where I kind of speak from my perspective as a musician and where I think musicians ought to be in their headspace. You can see a picture here. I don't know if you can read that, if it's too small on your screen or not. But one of my teachers, my teacher at Florida State, Michael Corzine, has been for a very long time, since the middle of the 1980s, the director of music, the organist and choir master at First Presbyterian Church in Tallahassee, Florida. He's been a wonderful mentor to me throughout my professional life as a student and beyond. But when Michael retired, some of his students presented him with a Zimbelstern, which is a little fun toy on the organ, the Taylor and Booty organ at First Presbyterian, and gave him this plaque, which reads, Michael Corzine, organist, teacher, and interpreter of the gospel. And that's a moniker that I know his colleague, Brant Copeland, who was the longtime pastor of that congregation, was fond of using. But I have really loved that for ever since I first saw it. Organist, teacher, and interpreter of the gospel. It speaks volumes to the role that church musicians have in a congregation, not just an organist, not just a performer, but also a teacher, in Michael's case, both as a professor and as a teacher within the congregation, but an interpreter of the gospel. There was the famous Lutheran church musician, Paul Montz, who talked about there being two preachers on Sunday morning, right? The one that's in the pulpit and the one that's in the organ loft. Or in, if we're going to update that language a little bit, the pastoral leadership and the musical leadership, both preachers, both interpreters of the gospel for what we do in worship on Sunday. And because of that, because we're dealing with ourselves as a pastoral leader, the mindset of the church musician has to be a little bit different than it might otherwise be in a secular setting. And that's what I want to talk about now. So as a church musician, I would like to posit that there is no, quote, good music or bad music in the church. That in a lot of ways, we have to learn to ditch our conservatory training. So if you're like me, at least for your undergrad, you were trained in a rigorous conservatory environment where the expectation was that you learned the canon of Western music, and you learned kind of how to evaluate what music was good and how to evaluate what music was less than good based on these Western musical traditions, kind of using the 7 elements of musical style or other similar rubrics. So I wanted to just ask the question of folks, and Brian will help me out with this, to see how you were trained to evaluate good music. So what did that mean for you?
So at this point, if you would like to respond to that, we're asking for verbal responses. So you can share, put in the chat if you would like to respond to that, and then I will send you a request or allow you to talk, as is the language that Zoom gives me here. John, maybe you want to say the question one more time.
Yes, I would like to know how some of you who were trained as musicians, how it was that you were taught to think about good or bad music. What does good or bad music mean for you as a musician?
So if you'd like to respond to that, just say so in the chat really quickly, and then I will activate your audio ability. All right, Allison Dean, all right, Allison, you should be able to unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Well, before I went to music school, I was already a practicing church musician. And so by the time I got there, they couldn't sort of, I guess, indoctrinate me about like, this is good or bad, because I'd already had this experience and my own tradition. I'm Anglican, but we in our setting, we have a very eclectic church music taste, right? So we sing all those lovely classical Anglican hymns, but also, those American Southern gospel hymns and also gospel music. And so it's interesting, although I went to Acadia University, which is in Eastern Canada, and they also had like a world music program where they had all these like different instruments and stuff like that. So it was an interesting place to be, where they didn't necessarily say that one was better than the other.
Allison, I had a similar experience at Florida State, whereas it was a Western focused program that I was in, but there was a very large ethnomusicology program, a lot of world music. So yeah, it's not to say that we weren't trained in this is the only good music, but there were definite ways that we were taught to think about at least Western music. But I wanted to cue in. Can I ask you to say more, please, about the subject of taste? You had mentioned that as something that people were addressing at music school. Can you talk a little bit more about what taste means in that context?
In the context of music school, you're saying?
Yes, or in the context of church music, for that matter.
Okay. Well, taste, I think has a lot to do with exposure, because we tend to gravitate heavily towards the things that we're used to and the things that we were conditioned to think of as oh yeah, I really like this. And so taste is always something that's highly personal. And that personal aspect can have a collective dimension, because if you're part of a community, where the community has been formed by particular things, and so that's just what you have come to like and appreciate. I have been in places where the tastes have changed over the years, but again, it's because now we've introduced something else, and in a sustained way. And so then people come to appreciate it. Oh, okay, yeah, I like this because I really didn't know anything about this before. But now that I've been introduced to it, and now that I see that it can function in this way, then it's not so bad as I thought it was.
Yeah, that's really great. I especially appreciate your the fact that you've linked the idea of taste to the idea of familiarity. I think that's so key. And as you say, kind of sustained exposure to things can lead to a change in taste. And I think that's a powerful thing to remember when looking at church music, both because after you've been established there as a leader, it's a really useful way of thinking about if you need to expand the repertoire of your congregation, a safe and kind of fruitful way to do that. But also as a new member of the congregation, recognizing that the taste of the community that you're in, that is the things that are familiar to the community that you're in, may not be the things that are familiar to you personally. And so that poses a bit of a danger, and also makes it ever more important to understand the community that you're going to serve as you go into it as a new leader, right? Needing to build that trust and introduce change in an incremental way. And I was just thinking how similar that is to the way I introduce new foods to my children. That like I know for instance that I love Thai curries because I've had them a lot and I think they're delicious. But the concept that I would sit a very strange looking Thai curry with like tofu in it to my 4-year-old son and expect him to just love it and eat it and have it become part of his favorite things is foolhardy, right? So the parallels there are for taste, both in the realm of food and the realm of music making, are really interesting.
Interestingly, anytime you talk about taste, I think about my professor Chris Anderson, who I had at SMU, because he has a whole class lecture on taste in the 19th century.
Yes. The 19th century idea of taste is I think so prevalent still today, Brian. So that whenever we have another session, we can talk about that.
It reminds me of this meme. But Michael Hahn, who is his colleague and my professor, wants to chime in. So Michael Hahn.
Hi, Brian. Brian and Jonathan, thank you so much. Jonathan, you've raised some really good issues. Of course, my education is quite old at this point, but I think some of the ideas are still prevalent, not just among my generation. And I had some really broad education. One of the changes I think that's taken place, and I'm very much pleased to see, is that the aspects of music ministry were kind of siloed. And so when you talked about a hymn, you talked about what appeared on the page, as opposed to even the experience of it. Or for musicians, they wouldn't even look at the text. You're talking only about the melody and those kind of things. I think we're much more aware of how all of those kind of issues work together. I think there was an implicit kind of hierarchy of values, even when the styles were broadly interpreted, Western. And in my case, I even had aspects of what you might call the early stages of global music in my doctoral work. A professor who was very much oriented in this way and introduced to ethnomusicology, or as it was called back then, systematic musicology. That tells you how old I am. So, but there was kind of an implied hierarchy about classic Victorian hymnody versus gospel song, or classic hymn forms versus ones with refrain, and then heaven forbid just choruses, and things about those. But again, they were siloed, and you looked at them specifically as pieces by themselves and not in their function. So I think I'll stop there and see if you have any responses.
Yes, man, what an excellent lead into the very next thing I was going to say. Thanks, Michael. Yeah, so I think the last thing you just said, with looking at them individually and not with respect to their function, I think is the key thing for me. And I want to just also shout out to Lisa, who put in the chat that she made a practice of, when serving new congregations, of surveying old bulletins to find out what has been included in the congregation's hymn repertoire. I think that's an excellent practice, and one that I've also done. And I would have a constant back and forth, for instance, with the choir as we prepared music over my first few years at a place. And every time I planned a hymn, we would sing it in the choir, and I say, is this a familiar hymn to the congregation? Like scale of 1 to 10, do we know this? It's a good way of avoiding crashing and burning on Sunday. But yeah, Michael's point about the function brings me to a document. As many of you may know, Roman Catholics really love their documents. And that's actually one of the things I really appreciate about working in a Roman Catholic context, is that there are many wonderful documents that help people think through these issues. 2 of them are Music and Catholic Worship from the 1970s and Sing to the Lord from the early 2000s. And shout out to Mike McMahon, who I know was an active creator of Sing to the Lord. But they talk about a threefold judgment when thinking of church music. There is, of course, the musical judgment. We have to think about that, whether the music has good internal integrity, because if it doesn't have good internal integrity in whatever genre or style that it's in, then it's probably not going to work very well. But there are 2 other aspects of this judgment. And the idea is that this is one judgment about a piece of liturgical music that has 3 parts. So there's the musical aspect. There's also the liturgical aspect of the judgment, right? How is this going to function in worship? Like, what is its purpose in the service, right? To give 2 easy examples, if it is communion time, are we singing a hymn that is pertinent to communion, right? We're not going to sing a baptism hymn while we are receiving communion. That doesn't make any sense. But it could be something like, are we in the middle of a stewardship drive? And if that's the case, are we looking at hymns that tend to emphasize stewardship of kind of time and talents? So then there's the third aspect of the judgment, and that is the pastoral aspect. And this is an aspect which also I think probably gets most frequently overlooked, and one that's easiest to mess up when you don't know a congregation well. So we have to think about, getting back to the point about taste and familiarity and approaching change, that if we are to be a good leader, part of that leadership is going to require us to usher in change, to encourage change in the congregation, because the congregation cannot stay static. The Spirit is always moving in the church, and any church congregation that refuses to change is in some ways denying the voice of the Spirit, denying the movement of the Spirit among them. And the tricky part is that you as a leader have to recognize the kind of ripe moments for that kind of change and do it in a way that's pastorally sensitive. So being open to the Spirit's promptings, that means planning new things, planning new types of music, opening the congregation's eyes to musics from around the globe or to musics from different populations that are already in their midst, but doing so in the way that's also not going to alienate the congregation. So as I think Brian has oft put it, kind of looking at who the congregation is now, who are we here, and also who is God calling us to be. So when we're looking at overarching planning concepts for worship as a church musician, we have to look at that threefold judgment. The musical judgment, does it have internal integrity? Is it just a well done piece of music in whatever style or genre? But also the liturgical judgment, is it working? Is it functioning in worship? And is it pastorally sensitive for our congregation? Is it representing what we need to represent as a leader? So all of those things, all three parts of that judgment, the musical, the liturgical, and the pastoral, all require knowing the individual spirituality of the congregation. So getting to the second bullet point there in the purple circle, we have to do a lot of legwork as a leader in the congregation to just know who we're dealing with. And that's not anything that's new to the church, right? There are, in secular jobs, we think about basically, can we do the job that we're being hired to do, right? And are we going to relate well to our coworkers? And if we're a leader in that organization, that secular organization, we're also going to think, do we understand the culture of this organization, and are we going to help it go where it needs to go? Similarly, in church jobs, we have to think about, yes, can we do the job, right? Do we have the chops to play the instruments we're being asked to play or sing or conduct or whatever? How well will we relate to the congregation? That is our kind of personal style of faith, our kind of personal life of faith, congruent with this congregation, or is it going to be a constant rub, right? You're not going to take someone who is an Orthodox church musician and put them in a Pentecostal church and expect this to relate well. So from that perspective, getting back to what pastors and committees ought to ask, knowing the applicant's spirituality is going to help you think about whether this is going to be a good fit. And from the musician's perspective, you have to know your own faith perspectives and whether this is going to help or hinder your relationship to the congregation. But then there's also just the aspect of knowing whether we're going to relate well to our coworkers, our pastoral colleagues, other musician colleagues, members of church councils, sessions, or whatever. And I think in addition to the interview process, it's really, really important for any prospective applicants to kind of do their homework on the congregation, right? You can know generally what a Lutheran congregation is going to be like, what a Baptist congregation is going to be like, but in a society that's as large as ours, and with denominations becoming increasingly pluralistic with regard to the cultures that are represented within the denomination, I think it's really important to look at the particular community that you're looking to go to and scope out its history, scope out its theology and spirituality, scope out its polity, so you understand things about power dynamics. And the first thing to do when looking at that is to read the job description carefully. So I wanted to ask if Brian, actually I think the handout that you already have, you have at the end of it a sample jobs blast. So I wanted to take just maybe 2 or 3 minutes for people to peruse that jobs blast and maybe take focus down on one of the job listings that you see there, and point out some interesting things that may clue you into what this congregation is like. So let's take maybe just 2 minutes to take a quick read through that. Is that good, Brian?
Yeah, that works. You want me to share it?
Yeah, well, no, because people can't scroll through it. So unless you can put it in the chat box with as the document or whatever.
No, it won't let me do that.
That's okay. Everybody should have it in the handout.
Mm-hmm.
And so as you look through that, I'll just say a couple of things, a couple of ways that I've always done my homework when looking at new congregations, and similarly what I advise my students and other colleagues to do when they've asked me about this. So scope out the congregation by going to their website. Pretty much every congregation nowadays has a website or at least a Facebook page. Look at the pictures, read their descriptions of who they are. So like I said, go on their social media pages as well, see how active they are. You can look up their statistics depending on what denomination you're dealing with. So congregations want to make themselves look good, just like companies do in hiring. But you can get some really interesting information, especially on the websites of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the United Methodist Church, and the Presbyterian Church USA. All of those denominations keep really detailed information on their congregations. So for instance, you can go on an ELCA website, search for a congregation, and look at a lot of information like and total attendance at worship over the last, say, 10 years, enrollment in Christian education classes. You can even, for the PCUSA, I think you can even get demographic information for most of those congregations. So you can really kind of get to know just the surface of who these people are based on their stats. And all of that stuff is available to one degree or another online. So it helps you kind of think of how you're going to fit into the congregation. Anybody find anything yet in any of these jobs that stuck out to them as part of the description for any of the individual jobs? If I remember it right, let's see, I'm looking over it now. I've got an Episcopal congregation, a Roman Catholic congregation, a cluster of Roman Catholic congregations that are now a single parish, and a United Methodist Church, and a non-denominational church, community church in Grand Rapids. So kind of a smattering of different traditions there. Looks like Maryland has raised their hand.
Okay, Marilyn, you can unmute yourself.
I'm just retired from working in a Lutheran church for the last 25 years. And before that, I grew up Presbyterian and had about 10 years in a large Episcopal church before that. So what stood out to me as I'm flipping through these job descriptions quickly is several of them said they wanted someone who was familiar with United Methodist traditions and heritage or Lutheran background. And I don't feel that my denomination hopping hindered me while I was doing that. And so I'm just, and committees never asked me about that either, but you know, I'm wondering how strong of why that's a strong point in several of these and how you feel about that.
Yeah, thanks. I think it is a really, really important thing for congregations to ask those that are affiliated with a denomination, just because I think a lot of people underestimate the extent to which denominational identities still inform the practices of faith for different communities. That's especially in traditions where the pastor is also the head of staff, which is not always the case. But you know, like obviously pastors in a denominational context get trained in a denominational seminary most of the time. And so they're going to be really kind of tuned in to the particulars of a tradition. So I think from your experience and my experience in denominational traditions are rather similar in that I never felt it a hindrance so much that I also came from a Presbyterian background, that I was going into, say, a Lutheran church or a United Methodist church. But that has been less the case the farther kind of afield I've gotten from my home tradition. But I also want to key in that familiar, there's a really interesting thing that saying they're seeing someone familiar with a particular tradition is much different than seeking someone that is a member of a different tradition. So for instance, let's see here. For St. John Newman Catholic Church, where did it go? Oh, I may not actually be in this one. But for many of these, especially for Roman Catholic churches, they'll say something like, prefer a candidate who is an active practicing Catholic, right? So that's a clear sign that if you are not Roman Catholic, you need not apply. That also is a lot of the times the case with some other churches. For instance, right, for the last one, for Hillside Community Church, one, you have to agree with their vision and mission statement for the church, right? So you have to buy into their particular brand of Christianity, and you have to be willing to become a member of the congregation. So for me, that raises red flags, because if I'm like as an applicant, because if I am, say, a Christian who's leaning pretty strongly towards one particular way of faith, it's going to be a bit of a rub for me to go into this congregation and be expected to become a member of it, especially because I know some musicians have the kind of a practice of not becoming members of the communities they serve, so that they can maintain a sense of professional distance between them and the congregation, which can be a healthy thing and can be a useful thing depending on your perspective. So, but that being said, when going into a congregation that is asking that, I just always continue to do my homework. Like when I first served a United Methodist parish, I took the Book of Discipline, which is like the book of canon law, and I just read the whole thing so that I could become familiar with the way the United Methodists kind of set themselves up, be familiar with power structures and stuff like that. One of the things that I think is the most important about that is that if you're familiar with, if you're unfamiliar, say, with the United Methodist tradition, you need to know that the pastor has pretty much, ultimate authority over the runnings of the congregation, quite unlike, say, most Reformed contexts where you have a church council or a session that is doing a lot of the ultimate leadership of the congregation, and the pastor functions as, say, head of staff and moderator of the session, but does not have say, overarching oversight of the life of the congregation. So different denominations do that differently, and just needing to know the background is a really, really useful thing. Let's see here. Anybody else have anything that stuck out at them? If not, I have a couple of stories to tell about one time where I managed to get myself into a situation that I fit really, really well, and one time where I managed to do something that did not fit so well. But I'll wait a couple of minutes to see if somebody else wants to chime in about some of these job postings. All right, so just two quick stories about how actually, maybe just one quick story about how I didn't do something really well. There have been a few congregations where I think I fit really, really well, and my time there was not without bumps, but overall all very happy. I already mentioned First Presbyterian in Havana. I had a similar experience at a large United Methodist church in Tallahassee. But I had one experience at a church I used to serve in the Tampa area. It was a Lutheran church where at first I thought the fit was really good. The staff and I got along really well. There was a lot of good energy. The church had undergone a split and basically cut its membership in half in the year just prior to my arrival. And the directive that I got when I got there was, we're going to kind of rebuild ourselves as a community. We want music to be part of that process. And so here you go. And I came in with that in mind and started making some changes, some of which were well received, some of which were more difficult. But I think one of the big things I did wrong at that church is that I did not take enough time to understand the profound impact that the schism they had in membership had on the congregation, and how that affected their willingness to undergo change. And also, I did not adequately understand the way they viewed the church musician as a staff member. Whereas I got the message from the interim pastor who had hired me that I was to be an integral part of the kind of pastoral leadership. That was not how the congregation understood who I was, and I didn't put that together. And that is my fault, ultimately, for not taking enough time to consider who I was being asked to be for that community of faith. And after a few years there, it became really clear that that it had become an ill fit, that it was not really a good fit for me nor for the congregation. And it's at that point that I ended up needing to leave. And that's one of the reasons why there's been just a couple of those through my career, but that's one of the reasons why I encourage people to do as much homework as possible, to have extensive conversations with the church leadership. And once you are on staff, to really take time to understand not just who you want yourself to be as a leader, but who the congregation wants you to be as a leader, and always to keep that kind of interplay in the front of your mind. I also failed to understand in that congregation the difference between kind of de facto structures of power and de jure structures of power. So whereas the de jure structures of power, the structures that are kind of built into the, say, congregation's constitution, gave me a fair amount of authority to do what I thought best for the congregation. The de facto structures were quite different, and there was some leadership, some lay leadership in the congregation that actually held a lot of the power and the decision-making influence, and I didn't well understand that. So when going in addition to kind of reading the books and reading up on what your congregation or what your denomination is meant to do, it's also important to recognize how at an individual congregation level, at the local level, there may be movers and shakers who are exerting influence, and those are the people you kind of need to understand and know. All right, so just lastly, a quick look at the different roles of a church musician, and these are things I've already really talked about a lot. But the primary role that I always think about is fostering the congregation's song. So not being an organist, not leading a choir, but fostering the congregation's song. And by phrasing it that way, I intentionally want to decenter the leadership, recognizing that the song of the assembly, which is the primary music for worship, that is the song that belongs to the congregation, belongs to the community, and does not belong to me. So it's not my job to prompt the it's not my job to kind of like help or enable the congregation to sing. That is their job to do. It's my job to accompany them in that, to provide guidance and leadership, and to just foster the song that is theirs. And by the same token, as a keyboardist, as an organist, my job is not to lead them in the sense that I am establishing what should be done, but my job is to accompany them in a joint exercise of music making. And with all that in mind, that's what I use to do my other work, picking congregational song from week to week, leading choirs, leading other ensembles, playing solo repertoire. All those things come under fostering the congregation's song and accompanying them in their journey of faith. And then lastly, just being a spiritual leader, recognizing that some of what I do has nothing whatsoever to do with music, but just has to do with being a spiritual leader, a pastoral leader for the people, whether that be the people just in the choir or the congregation as a whole, or the people that walk in off the street and just want to know what you're about as a congregation. As one of the more visible leaders in the church on Sunday mornings, it's been oft that a person comes up to me after the service and wants to talk about what's going on in their life or what's going on in the congregation and ask questions. And I'm there to answer those questions just like pastoral leadership would be. And that's all I've got. So I don't know, Brian, how much time exactly we have for any Q&A.
Yeah, we've got a few questions. The first one that's actually in the Q&A is there this is from an anonymous attendee, is there an ideal time span to remain in a congregation? Are some tenures too long?
I have no idea, but I haven't actually had a terribly long tenure yet in any given place at a church, because I've had to move around for family reasons and because I was moving in and out of school. But I've heard it said that the 7-year mark is the mark when most leaders are able to exercise their greatest amount of influence. But I think I'm just speaking out of sheer ignorance here. I think you can be a good leader for 1 year and have an amazing impact. You can be a good leader for 30 years and have an amazing impact. But I think by always centering the congregation and not centering yourself as a leader, you're setting yourself up to just always have a feedback loop where you're recognizing whether you're still being a good leader in that congregation or not. And it's not really tied, in my head, it's not really tied so much to the amount of time you are there, but what you're doing while you're there. Because the congregation is the ultimate, is the unit, right? It is the pastoral leadership, the musical leadership is there to serve the congregation, not to kind of lead the congregation to some point and then leave it and then vamoose, So that's kind of what by decentering yourself, you're allowing the congregation to be who it is.
Yeah, that also speaks towards, seeing it as a discernment process. So it's this kind of active discernment process. It also leaves open the possibility of coming into an unhealthy group dynamic that needs years to unwork so that you can then begin some good work. Right. Or maybe you enter into a wonderful group dynamic where you can hit the ground running.
Yeah, right. I think discernment, as you say, that's the key thing.
Yeah. Another question for you. Could you speak to the difference, and maybe this is great for people who are watching who might be on a committee who's doing a search, or a pastor who's creating a job description for an upcoming search or something, the difference between posting a salaried position and an hourly position and the dynamics at play there?
What type of position should be salaried versus hourly? Is that the question?
Right. Or even, strictly saying, here's your salary, it's 12 hours and this is what or we're going to pay you hourly and you have to track your hours.
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if there's a terribly big difference there. I don't know that I've ever had a church position where I actually had to track my hours that carefully. I think the more frequent thing is this is a 10-hour a week position, so this is what we kind of expect you to do, and we'll give you this salary. But it is more common in my experience to have things like, here's a salary that you're going to get, but things like weddings and funerals or whatever are extra. I think from the perspective of the musician, this is just me speaking personally, it is more useful to me to know that I have a salaried amount that is coming in, because as someone who's needing to piece together their work, that I'm going to kind of know in advance whether I'm going to make ends meet. It's also a little bit safer, I think, both from the musicians and the congregation standpoint, because giving fluctuates, and also with as pastoral leaders well know, the amount of work at any given season drastically fluctuates. So it's just a little weird from a financial planning standpoint to say, in the middle of the summer, I'm only working 6 hours a week, and at Christmas I'm working 50, 60 hours a week. So that's just a little unsettling. And beyond that, it gives a bit of stability in the mindset of what we want our musician to be, to say, here is your salaried amount, because it's a bit of a commitment on the church's part to say, you are a part of this team, you are a regular part of who we are. And so we're going to kind of pay you accordingly. But that's just, I think it can go either way. That's just my personal perspective on it.
Another question that's come in from Marilyn Murchison. Any thoughts on hiring a full-time music director now with COVID restrictions? Beyond the audition, which will be different from usual, is it a difficult time to start ministry? Everything is still on Zoom, and this would be hard to develop relationships with children, teens, and adults.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it is a really weird time to hire people because of that very thing, because I think it's virtually impossible to gain any sort of level of trust or level of relationship with the members of the congregation if you can't like go hang out with them at coffee hour or at the fellowship hall on Wednesday night or whatever your church's tradition is. But that being said, I have noticed a considerable uptick in the amount of full-time, this is largely within the Roman Catholic realm, because that's like most of the students that I'm around, that's the jobs they're looking for. A considerable uptick in the amount of full-time church musician jobs that have come available. At the beginning of the pandemic, they all dried up, obviously. But then a few months after that, I've just seen a real steady stream, and I know a lot of people that have been hiring. I think that's very weird, and I can't explain it. But yeah, from my perspective, if you can't be there to be, if you're looking to hire somebody full time, if you can't be there to be part of the congregation and to build community with them in person, with physical presence, then that's going to really hinder your work, those first few years where you're getting to know the congregation and kind of learning the musical tradition, and just kind of setting you up for a lot of missteps when that day finally comes.
Fantastic. Another, here's a chat question. Accompanying congregation, if you follow them while playing, what happens to the tempo? I do not accompany hymns, I lead them. I accompany soloists, I follow their lead.
Yeah, I get like a lot of flack on this because I haven't come up with the right language for it. But I think what you identified, Dorothy, about accompanying soloists also holds true for congregations. So it's not so much that you don't establish a tempo, but it's more the fact that you are sensitive to what's happening to the congregation in the moment, both with respect to tempo and with respect to other things, length of breaths, the robustness with which they're singing, and things like that. So when leading a congregation, I will typically set a tempo in the introduction, but then within the context of the hymn itself, that tempo needs to flex a lot. Because every time you get to a breath mark, for instance, you have to leave a lot of space, and you have to listen really keenly to the congregation and hear and feel when they take a breath, the same way you do with a soloist. And if you've done this a lot, as I'm assuming you have, you know you can kind of sense when a soloist is taking a breath, even when you can't see them. You can either hear it or you can just kind of feel it in the room. And that's the kind of dynamic interplay I also feel with the congregation. You can, even when I'm in an organ loft and I can't see what's going on in the congregation, I can feel them take that breath. And so I'm very sensitive to them being the primary music maker, just like the soloist is a primary music maker when singing solo repertoire or when playing solo repertoire. And I think also that most congregations have a really keen sense of the tempos of the hymns that they know well. If it's something new, you might have to kind of like help out more. But if they're singing Amazing Grace or To God Be the Glory or whatever, Hail Holy Queen or something, they're going to know. Had to throw that one in there for a bit of rounding out the denominational spectrum. They're going to know what tempo they sing that at. So your job is to be there to accompany and encourage them and kind of play off of their energy, but your job is not to tell them how to sing it, right? So like I've introduced a hymn before. Take a really easy example. I've introduced what's it? Then sings my soul, my Savior's love to me. How great thou art. I'll introduce it and I'll like put all the dots into the refrain, because that's like how I grew up singing it. And then as soon as it starts, the congregation doesn't sing the dots. So after verse 1, I know to myself, okay, don't play the dots, because they don't sing it that way. So the idea is that they're the boss. They know their repertoire. It is their song. And I am there to encourage them to play off of them, but not to lead them and tell them how to do it.
I think a lot of colleges or music departments and stuff have started offering collaborative piano degrees rather than accompanying, right? So it's like the collaboration might be
Yeah, collaboration is good. Yeah. I got to come up with some better language, because every time I give the talk on organ, on hymn playing, and do like workshops and stuff like that, people are like, "What do you mean don't lead?" And so yeah, I need better language. So thank you, Dorothy, for reminding me to fix that.
But it also has to do with like the way we've been taught to lead by culture, and in some very unhealthy ways, because lead, means you have the power. And so if there's an unhealthy power dynamic, leading a hymn can be a very unhealthy way to sing.
Yeah.
So I agree.
That's what I was
language.
thinking about at first, was leading has to do with, the current, there's a big difference in leadership in the kind of bullish corporate way that we envision, and the kind of servant leadership that is required of church musicians and pastoral leaders. Yeah.
Mike McMahon puts in the chat, as this same for pastors,
Right.
this kind of larger question of how we lead. Mm-hmm. Well, folks, it's been about an hour and 17 minutes. And so it's time to wrap up. Jonathan, do you have anything to bring us to a close?
No, just another thank you to you and to all the Hymn Society staff and to everybody that's here. I really wish I could see everyone's faces, because that would, or better yet, just be in the same room with you.
You're stuck with my face.
I already know your face. But no, it's really great to be here with everybody. And thanks for being here. Follow me on social, because the more you follow me on social, the more I can follow you on social. And then I learn more about what's going on in the world of church music.
Thank you, everybody. If you know anyone who would benefit from seeing this, we'll have it posted on YouTube for free, probably tomorrow, but give me a couple days before you email me saying it's not there, and we'll try to send out an announcement. This is the end of the very first Ambassadors webinar series. Jonathan brought us to a close here. We started way back in September of COVID time. And so look for more things in the future. If you know anyone who would make a great ambassador, we are now accepting applications for the next 4 days. The deadline is the end of April. For a new class of ambassadors. Our current class has been serving for 2 or even more years.
Putting me out to pasture.
Actually, yeah, sending Jonathan. He's been serving since we did a pilot program, 5-6 years ago.
It was more than that.
It may have been more than that when we did the second of our very first ambassadors programs to test it out. So thanks, John, and thank you, everybody. Take care.